So, Mr. Spencer Nauman, thank you for spending time with us today to share some really important history of Nauman, Smith, Schisler, and Hall, which I believe is the oldest law firm in Harrisburg. Is that true?
Well, that's what we say. We go back to 1871.
And how did it start in 1871? I know you don't know that personally, but what do the records support?
Well, Wayne McVeigh and Lyman Gilbert and one other gentleman started, and a man named McPherson started the firm in 1871. And they were fairly young lawyers who worked some on the Hill and some for the railroads and things like that. So they started the firm.
Now, was that Gilbert related to the Gilbert that then was involved with McNeese, Wallace, Norrick? Wasn't there a Gilbert that ended up over there?
Well, that's Gilbert Norrick, but no. There was Lyman Gilbert and Spencer Gilbert, and I'm named after Spencer Gilbert. And Lyman Gilbert was a lawyer, and Spencer Gilbert got the bright idea to put grocery stores together and be a wholesale grocer. So he was Harrisburg Grocery, and that beautiful building that's in the Harrisburg Hospital complex across 3rd Street was Harrisburg Grocery, and they were Spencer Gilbert's baby.
And how are you related to him?
I'm about a 4th cousin once removed.
Oh.
Spencer Gilbert's wife and my grandmother were sisters.
Ah, okay.
And my father had 7 brothers and sisters.
Wow.
And they ran out of names, so they named it after their rich brother-in-law, Spencer Gilbert. So that became Spencer Gilbert Nauman. That's when it started, down in Lancaster.
Well, you're the first name in the law firm, Nauman, Smith, Schisler, and Hall. So were you that Nauman that founded
Well,
the
it's
firm?
nice that people think of that, and I usually let them go ahead and think about it that way. If they want to, if they want to say something bad about the firm, then I explain that that's my father's name and not my name.
So where did he go to law school?
He went to Penn a little bit, and then he was an undergraduate at Haverford, and then he went to some few classes at Penn, and then he read law with his brother-in-law in Lancaster.
Well, let me see. Then Smith. So that was Colonel Smith, right?
That was Colonel John Mackay Smith.
And tell me about him.
Well, the colonel worked on the Reading Railroad for years as a train dispatcher, and then he went to Princeton at the age of 30 or something like that.
Wow.
And he was in the class of 1915, which is a class at Princeton where they think they're closer than any other class ever was. So the colonel used to go to all the reunions and stuff, but he was like 20 years older than any of his classmates. But the colonel did practice tax law and regular law, and also was very active in the Pennsylvania Bar Association. He was the volunteer secretary for 20 years of the Pennsylvania Bar Association.
Is that right? Wow.
Before they hired, I can't remember what the man's name was who was.
So how did he get the title colonel?
Oh, well, he was very active in the National Guard, and he was Captain Smith for years. He had the proverbial flat feet, but he managed to talk them into letting him go to France in 1917, and he was with the 28th Division, and then he came back, and then he was in the National Guard during the 30s, and then he was with the Selective Service, which was a draft in Pennsylvania. General Hershey was bound and determined that all the state heads had to be full colonels. So he rose to be colonel. And then General Bailey, who you know may have known, yeah, General Bailey was head of the 28th Division, and he asked Colonel Smith to be the first judge advocate in the reorganization of the 28th after
Wow.
1946. So he had a very active time in the
I'll say.
National
and he
Guard.
practiced mostly tax law.
Mostly tax law, yeah.
Never went back to representing the railroad where he once worked.
No, well, because we were Pennsylvania Railroad people rather than Reading Railroad people. So,
That was. Tell me about that history. A lot of people.
well, that goes back to Lyman Gilbert and Mr. McPherson and those people, and Wayne McVeigh. And they've been representing the railroad since 1871. And they did, you remember when Mr. Schussler
Well, we're about to get to Mr. Schisler. Yes, Wilhelm Schisler is a legend, and he was spoken about in many of our other oral histories, that he was renowned to have an interesting personality, for one. We'll leave it at that. But that you had to get his approval to practice law in Dauphin County. He was one of the screeners, but I'm sure they had the nicer name for them than that.
He was I guess he was the secretary. I had the same problem because I was working in the office and working for him, and I had forgotten to file the papers, because in those days we had to file papers as a law student for like an indentured servant to say you, and so I had to file an application nunc pro tunc, having graduated from law school and working in his office, to be allowed to be a clerk in his office. And Tom Buckley, I remember, was particularly annoyed at having to do that, and he was all set to file a complaint. And he didn't know that I was in the same problem that he had, but he was going to file a complaint that I got favored service from Schisler.
Well, going back to Wilhelm Schisler, he began practicing law with the firm early, obviously. What would that have been?
About 1930 or 31, when they reorganized the firm in 1930. Judge Cunningham, I believe his name was, went on the Superior Court, and Charles Bergner, who owned the building we were in, died, and so Colonel Smith and my father and William Herlock, who was Charles Bergner's nephew, there was a lot of relationship marketing and organization, if you know about the bar, reorganized as Nauman Smith and Herlock in 1930, and Mr. Schisler came to work for them.
Do you remember where he went to school, law school?
He went to Dickinson and Dickinson Law School.
Both, okay.
He took the train from Harrisburg and went over to Dickinson.
And he began representing the railroad.
Right away, yeah. Well, my father was representing the railroad as a litigator, and he was helping, and he had an office in New Cumberland at that point. Mr. Schisler was a member of both the Cumberland County and the Pennsylvania and the Dauphin County Bar, which was very unusual in those days.
Yes, you had to sort of select what club you were going to be
Yeah.
over.
After when I was there, he was always using a lawyer in Cumberland County, but he still kept up his membership as if he could practice law by himself in Cumberland County. Because you remember we had the red cards. It was really, like two different countries, if you'll remember.
And you were not allowed to practice in the other county, or if you did,
You had to
were looked
associate.
down upon.
Yeah,
So Judge Cunningham originally practiced with this firm?
yeah.
Even I didn't know that.
Yeah, if you, Bill Warren, he works for Saul Ewing. Saul Ewing has a book on the history of the Superior Court sitting in their lobby, which I have looked at. I don't think anybody else ever looked at it. But that's the first time I ever saw a picture of what Judge Cunningham looked like.
Well, we'll have to get a picture and hang it in here, I think, definitely.
Well, we had McPherson, who became a judge, but there were so many McPhersons. For a couple of years, we had the wrong McPherson on the website.
So tell me a little bit about Wilhelm Schisler. He's renowned for how he handled depositions and some other talents and personality traits. So tell me what you remember about Wilhelm Schisler.
Well, Wilhelm Schisler, he was always Mr. Schisler to me, and
Yes.
he had the corner office and he worked for 7 days a week, and he thought I was a little bit of a dilettante, so he didn't. So I think I was 5 years into the practice, and I found him a case which was a contract case involving novation, very obscure subject, and he decided maybe I could become a lawyer after all, because I found this case on novation. But I mean, he had a reputation, and he was quite a lawyer, and he would take all kinds of interesting cases. When I was going to Penn Law School, we didn't study Pennsylvania procedure because we were too good for that. We studied only federal procedure.
Of course.
And one of the things that was given to us was an article called Obfuscation and Delay in Pennsylvania Law. And the primary example was a slip and fall case in Hershey, at the Hershey Hotel, in which Mr. Schisler had filed 102 preliminary objections.
He was a taskmaster, if I recall, when I was a very young lawyer.
Oh, yeah.
He did not speak much.
Oh, but
There was very little social engagement. It was all business.
well, when I came, he had both David Eaton and Jim Stewart working for him, and he would even have them prepare the same brief, and then he'd pick the best one. Now that led to a little bit of discussion. So Mr. Stewart said, "I'm going to stop being a litigation lawyer."
Well, Jimmy Stewart was also a very interesting personality. But let's move to the names of the firm, and we'll get back to some of that. So, Wilhelm Schisler, and then the last name of the firm is Hall. And tell me about Mr. Hall. I remember a lot about Mr. Hall, but I'm sure you know more than I do.
Mr. Hall went to Lawrenceville, and then he went to Princeton, and he always had a very good time in life, and that was nice. And then he practiced. He went to Dickinson Law School, and then he practiced law with Norman Smith. Then he joined the Navy in 1941 and went off to be. I think he was the aide. You know Pat Cameron, Doria Cameron's mother.
Yes, she ran St. Stephen's School for years.
Well, her father was an admiral, and I think Spencer Hall was his assistant. He went to London and did all kinds of things like that.
Wow, I did not know that.
And then he came back in 1945 and came back to the office. And he and the colonel came back from the war and started practicing law again. And he was city solicitor for Harrisburg, and then he was a friend of George Bailey's, and when the Commonwealth National Bank, then the Harrisburg National Bank, started to expand, he got Spencer Hall. The banks in that days never had regular attorneys, but Spencer Hall became the Commonwealth's attorney.
The Commonwealth National Bank's
Commonwealth National Bank's attorney, and helped with the mergers and acquisitions.
And he became chairman of the board, I think.
Eventually,
Or
yeah.
president. I forget what
Chairman of the board. When they merged with Lancaster, and then the Baileys and George Morrison had his problems with his health, and then they decided the council ought to become president or chairman of the board.
And in those days, you could borrow money from the bank with a handshake.
Yeah, it was called, what do they call it? Integrity borrowing? Yeah. Well, they had a certain reputation. The Dauphin had more of, they only loaned people money that didn't need it. So.
Well, and then Nauman Smith became the bank as lawyer, the
Oh,
firm.
yeah, we were the firm lawyer, and that's one of the things I did a lot of, was reading what they call the White Bible, which is the federal regulations on banking. And so there was an awful lot of daily stuff, the trust officers, the banking officers, questions on checks, questions on trusts, all that kind of. I did a lot of that for Spencer Hall. And I also did it for Wilhelm Schistler, because in those days he was doing the same thing for CCNB, which then became PNC.
So you had Nauman, Smith, Schistler, and Hall had some pretty major important clients during those formative years and many years after, which would include the railroad, several banks,
City of Harrisburg.
the city of Harrisburg, right?
What else do we have? We had
Well, then you
off and on
started
manufacturing, and then the Patriot News.
the Patriot News, yes, Jack Sullivan.
Well, Ernie Birch had that before.
Okay, I did not.
Ernie Birch, Ernie Birch and Ed Russell had been at Princeton together, I guess. And then, but then Ed Russell went to New York, and then they started using a lot more New York counsel. Then Sullivan started working on, on the libel and the telephone, and we had that big case with the representative from Williamsport who sued the paper.
I had forgotten
You worked
that
on
case.
yeah,
No, I did not.
okay. That was when Jack really came in, and then we started doing even more work for the Patriot. And then he started work on the open records, and then Craig has continued with that.
Right, came in. You said you started working for Mr. Schistler, and we all had to call him Mr. Schistler. But then you got involved in estates and trusts and that sort of work. And
Well, yeah, one of the reasons why I came. I mean, I'm in law school, and hiring was rather informal in those days, and I had worked here as a clerk and stuff, and I wanted to do tax work as much as anything else, federal tax work. And so I came, and the colonel was 85, and he was doing tax work such as it was. And so I thought that was a pretty good thing. So but there wasn't that much tax work. So I was doing estates and trusts, and then I was helping with the city, when they put in the earned income tax, I was working on that. And when the sales tax came along, I was working on that part. But the federal tax was what I was most interested in. And so then I got into nonprofits, because it started to get harder to organize a nonprofit, and you needed a lawyer to do that.
so when did you start practicing law with Nauman Smith?
1961.
So you've been here for a few years.
I've been, I've been, that's the only people I've ever been with, except being in the Army. That's the only employer I had.
So why do you think you went to law school? Was it because of your father?
Well, no, my father was not convinced that was the thing to do. He said that it was the satisfaction of winning a case was much less than the annoyance of losing a case. So he said it was not a self-satisfying profession to be in. But I knew that I needed, when I came out of college, it was 1955, and there were some people who were working with just a college education, but to do anything you had to have a postgraduate degree of some kind. And I had the family was going to pay for it, so that was nice. But when you applied for college, for law school in those days, some law schools wanted to know why you wanted to become a lawyer, and since I didn't know why I wanted to become a lawyer, those applications went in the wastebasket. Harvard, and I knew I wanted to go to probably one of the ones around here. So Harvard and Penn just asked for the transcript, and Penn not only just asked for the transcript, but when they were still working on the rules from the Second World War, that if you went in the military, they would hold a place for you while you were serving the country. So I thought that was nice. So and I got accepted at Penn, and so and then we had this military obligation at that point. So I was sorry. The recruiters came and saw me and said that I could be in the counterintelligence corps, which I knew that Judge Sugar over at Dickinson, Cumberland County, he was telling all his graduates from Dickinson to go be in the CIC, where we're investigators catching spies for the United States Army, and it was a pretty good deal. So I went in the Army for 3 years.
And were you involved in intelligence?
I was involved in intelligence, but when I was in the Army, it was an even better deal, because if you went to school, you didn't have to extend. Nowadays, they got smart, and if you go to an Army school or a Department of Defense school, you have to serve twice as long as the school was for.
Oh, I did not know that.
Well, it put a lot of money in it. So I went to school for 2 years out of the 3, and still got out early to go to law school. So you couldn't do that anymore. But so it was nice tour duty. I got to go to California and Germany. But my only profession at that point was catching spies for the United States Army, and you couldn't do much with that. So I went to law school.
Well, today they're catching spies by using the computers, but you didn't have computers when you were in the Army to use as a resource, did you?
No, it was all people. I mean, it was all. We interviewed people. I was up on the Czech-German border because they taught me how to speak German and things like that. See?
Wow.
So and
what's the most interesting incident?
Well, it wasn't. Luckily, I didn't have very many because, but you would go around and you would talk to the German officials, talk to the refugee office, talk to the border police, talk to the regular police, because they were doing all the work on the border, and these people would come across the border. My job was to interview people who came across the border who we were just becoming allies that the Germans thought might be interesting to the United States Army, who were sent over to get telephone books from the local concern and that kind of thing. So my tour was to walk around and to talk to all these people once a week. And then the people who they thought I should see, I should go talk. I talked to them in jail or wherever it was. It was, and then I would report once a week to Nuremberg with what I'd found. And
did you ever find anything?
oh, every so often you find something. I didn't type very well, and so you would write, well, I'd be happy if you didn't get a positive. But when you had a positive, you had to write a report and you had to type it out, and every time you came to mention a town, you had to put the map coordinates in, so you had to look. It was worse than citations. You had to go look up the citations and put them in. Wow. And that was good. I mean, that was you did
very tedious work. You seem to
well,
enjoy very tedious work.
Well, I got into tedious work. I mean, the computers do a lot of it now. That's what they are. But it was it was like research when you have to remember going down into the bowels of the state law library and
Yes.
all those old books down there.
Right.
Well, it was really grunt work. It was hard work. And then every so often you would find somebody, and then that would be a connection, and then you'd report that to Nuremberg, and they would pick somebody up in Munich, and they would find it. And then I did. I had learned Romanian in California, and so I went to Stuttgart to interview some Romanians that they caught, Romanian intelligence people who were doing much more high-level spying than I was dealing with on the border. But
Well, maybe you could do that again in your retirement.
no, well,
Now, how old
Yes.
are you now?
86, yeah.
Okay, so your next 10 years,
Yeah,
you could
exactly.
be,
Well-
no one would ever guess that you were a spy.
Yeah, but when I was in Stuttgart interviewing these people from Romania, okay, when we were with the CIA, okay, and the CIA said, "Why don't you come with us?" And I said, "No, I'm going home, go to law school." So I went home and I went to law school, and the only other people I interviewed with, besides Norman Smith, where the CIA came to the Penn Law School. So I said, okay, I'll go and see how I'm doing. So I went in, and having been to law school, they didn't want me. And I figured, I didn't know what's going on, but they really wanted me in the CIA when I could speak Romanian and do all this stuff in German. But having gone to the law school for 3 years, I speculated they might have thought I'd picked up some ethics or something like that anyway. So.
Oh, that's very interesting. So, tell me, you do a lot of estate law now. How has that practice changed in the last 50 years?
Well,
60 years?
we used to do awful lot of it in the office, but now actually Judge Swope was one of the people who changed the practice of estate law. We have to report to the court all the time. A lot of people, and my brethren at the bar, were living on the estates, and we had that one big scandal already in the Middletown of the lawyer.
Yes.
And so we have reports every 3 months that have to be done. And you can get a paralegal to do that, but anyway, but you have to remember to do that, otherwise you get called up in front of the Orphans Court. Then they changed the Orphans Court law.
But you didn't used to have to do that.
Didn't used to have to do that.
And so there were some lawyers that were not ethical.
Yeah, and you could keep estates open longer because the federal income tax on estates and trusts was much easier. The brackets started later, and then and you got into the higher brackets on the income tax slower. So you could keep an estate open for 5-10 years, and
Did that save the family taxes?
save the family a lot of taxes. So we did that, and then you charge those fees for all those years and help them with the returns and so forth. And then the other thing, well, as I say, now you have to try and get them done as fast as possible, because otherwise they get the adverse tax consequences, and then you have to report it.
It's my understanding the tax law has changed substantially
no,
in 60
well,
years.
Yeah, well, we used to spend an awful lot of time trying to avoid the federal estate tax rather than the federal income tax. And now the federal estate tax is up around $5 million, and if you have a wife, it can be $10 million. And then we have what's called portability, which we spent a great deal of time saving the taxes on the first to die, and then the second to die. Well, now you can not only You know, now if the first to die doesn't use up all of the 5 million, when the second to die does, you can take up the other part. So it's a lot different that way. And I say, we used to file federal estate tax returns for everybody because it was down low. Then we didn't file them. Now you do because of this portability thing, and the only way you can get the portability correct is if you file, if the first one to die, you file a Form 706 for them.
I want to talk about some other interesting members of the firm. One I'm thinking of is Dave Eaton, because his father, I recall, was a psychiatrist who actually lived on the grounds of the state hospital, which now, of course, has been closed. They've closed them all across the state, mostly, unfortunately. But that was very unusual, I thought.
Well, he was the, his father was the head of the state hospital and had been one of the other state hospitals when we had state hospitals before. So David, in effect, grew up at state hospitals. But David...
Because they lived on the grounds.
Lived on the grounds,
so he
yeah.
grew up among an entire community of people with mental health issues, some of which, they would put women in state institutions if they didn't listen to their husbands, and they were called hysterical or whatever name they used to give them. But I think most of the people on the state hospital grounds were truly mentally ill, and it would be very unusual, I would think, to grow up in that type of community.
Well, David was very sympathetic to that, but he really didn't want to practice the law that was involved. But he used to get referrals, and they used to call him the crazy lawyer. He didn't like that as a title. But it was a good background, and David was a really smart guy. I mean, he went to Allegheny, and then he went to Dickinson. He was in the Navy, too. And
very smart, yes, I remember.
And he was a disciple of Wilhelm Schistler. And we tried a couple cases together. We were trying a case, I was a witness, which was interesting. We were representing a bank, the Adams County Bank, I guess. They're down in Gettysburg. And I had to talk about the tax ramifications of the merger because they got one of the heirs. It was in these little small banks. You know, they would sell the stock on the courthouse steps. Because it was so popular, everybody wanted bank stock in the local towns. But this one family owned a whole lot of the stock, and they had persuaded one of the sons to sell the stock to one of the big banks in Maryland who was merging. So we're having this lawsuit, okay? So I'm on. David has me testifying on the tax implications of the merger. It was fun not doing that, but he took the defendant apart, which was pure Schistler on cross-examination. Sitting there watching that was very interesting.
So then you had Jack Sullivan, who also was a very bright and capable lawyer. He had been in the House of Representatives. So you had a lot of lawyers that were connected to politics in many ways. He
took Jim Bowman's seat when Jim Bowman was here, and Jim Bowman then went on to Dauphin County Court, and then Jack Sullivan followed him in as the legislature. And we were...
and then Jim Bowman became president judge of the Commonwealth
Court, yeah. And then, and Jack was then city solicitor. Spencer Hall had been city solicitor, and then he went over to the bank, and then Jim Bowman became city solicitor, and then Jack Sullivan became city solicitor, and I was the assistant city solicitor. And
that was under Mayor Doutrick?
That was under Mayor Doutrick and Dr. McBride.
And McBride?
I was the first, what would you call it? Anti-discrimination officer for the city of Harrisburg.
Well, now that's news to me. Tell me about that.
Well,
What mayor was this?
that was under Mayor McBride, I think, still.
Okay,
could have
that would
been
have been the
a-
60s?
It was the 60s.
Early 70s?
67 and 70s.
What had to be early 60s?
And they needed
It was
a
before
discrimination.
Swenson.
They needed a discrimination officer. So they said, well, the logical thing is to make one of the assistant city solicitors.
And why did they think they needed an anti-discrimination
Well, we were
officer?
building we had the sewer plant going, and then, which was city's problem, and then we also had, for some reason, we got into the building of Strawberry Square over here.
Yes.
And the Strawberry Square problem involved the bricklayers, because the bricklayers union wasn't letting anybody in. The bricklayers had a union shop, and therefore they did the training and they did everything else, and they weren't letting anybody in. So I was to go talk to them, and their excuse was that they thought Strawberry Square, they agreed to all this stuff with the people in Philadelphia, that they would do some affirmative hiring. And the people in Philadelphia said, you're not doing it. And they said, well, they thought Strawberry Square was going to all be brick instead of the plates of cement that also caused a major lawsuit.
Right.
And so I had to go over and talk to them about that. We solved that rather amicably. But then the sewer plant was getting built, and it didn't have anybody on the construction crews there. So
Talk about having minorities.
minorities. So they finally got a minority. I mean, I didn't have to do too much. I was filing papers and working and trying to persuade people as much as anything else. So that was a special moment. We went down to the sewer plant, and they finally had a minority, they thought. And so the people from Philadelphia, and if you remember, the Philadelphia office itself got into problems with having discrimination and
Sure.
sexual harassment and stuff. But anyway, they appeared, and they came down, and we were down there, and they brought this guy up to introduce him to him, and as a minority. And it turned out he was an American Indian.
Well, that's a minority.
Yeah, but
They were
he
looking
said,
for African
and
Americans.
yeah, but they still told him that he was American Indian. We were okay there. But then they asked him, are you an American Indian? He said no. He didn't want to admit he was American Indian. It was unlike Mrs. Warren or whatever. Anyway, so he didn't admit he was American
Talking about
Indian.
Elizabeth Warren, who's running for president.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So we had a pretty good time with that. But I thought it was nice that I was the first anti-discrimination officer for the
Well,
city of
I
Harrisburg.
think that should be more well known in the bar.
Give us some history of Ernie Birch, an interesting fellow.
Well, Ernie Birch grew up in Oil City, and he was he went to Princeton. In those days, we were living heavily with Princetonians. And he, after the war, he flew Navy planes flew them across the Atlantic like the women, which was almost as dangerous as flying in a combat situation.
Right.
And anyway, he came to work for us, and he did a lot of estates at that point, and he'd
Is his
been to
family
Yale.
involved in the oil business?
Yeah, he was one of the two families in the oil business, and his.
And I believe that's where his financial support came.
Yeah, I think it did. Yeah, but he was a good lawyer. He made a lot of money practicing Nauman Smith, and public utilities and doing estates, and he used to fly his airplane. He and Jim Bowen used to plan their flights up to northern Canada and so forth, and he also organized the Harrisburg Academy and got a lot of their land for their building where they are now. He was, because L.B. Smith would like to give, well, L.B. Smith had 3 daughters at the academy, or the Cider School and then the academy, and he wanted to give some of the land where the playing fields of the academy are now to the academy. So Ernie was the president of the board, and so New Year's Eve, L.B. Smith would fly in because he was under a subpoena from his wife's divorce, and land at the old Harrisburg airport and pick Ernie up, and they'd sign papers and get off.
And then he'd fly back home.
Flew back home to wherever he was.
Well, not his home, but where he was hiding, so to speak.
Yeah. So Ernie would do that, but Ernie had a lot of friends from the Yale Law School who, so we had a big connection with Kirkpatrick Lockhart at that time, and Ralph Boyles and I were running up back and forth to the Capitol filing papers. You may have done some of that, I don't know.
Well, Ralph Boyles had also an interesting history. He was also a fighter pilot, right?
Yeah, he was a fighter pilot, and then he was an anti-submarine pilot, and he did a lot of that, and then he did JAG for a while, Air Force JAG, and so those, and he worked for the banks. He did a lot of work for the banks.
Yes.
And let's see, who else? Yeah, and then we had, Jim Campbell was there.
Yes.
When things were a little looser at that point, because when I was in the National Guard, I just assumed that Nauman Smith was a patriotic employer, and took my 2 weeks with the National Guard, and then took 2 weeks vacation besides. Jim Campbell decided he had better ask. And he asked. And they told him that he couldn't take his 2 weeks. He had to take either or, his 2 weeks vacation or his 2 weeks with the Judge Advocate Corps. So I don't think that went over very well, among other things. But anyway.
Well, it was always pretty a conservative firm.
Yeah, but
the lawyers were good lawyers.
Yeah, Wilhelm Schistler, one of the more conservative people in this world, but he was always taking tricky cases, and he took one of the first smoking cases.
I did not know that.
But he took it the other. I mean, he was the other way. He decided he would defend the cigarette companies. Everybody said, "Why are you defending the cigarette companies?" He said, "You know," he told them, everybody's entitled to a defense and things like that." And so he took.
And they also paid lawyers' fees.
Yeah, but he won the case, and he won the case with research.
Do you remember who he represented?
It was
company?
American Tobacco, Lucky Strike. I remember it was.
But he did not smoke.
No, he didn't smoke, but he represented the cigarette company. There was this woman. It was a perfect case. The man had only smoked Lucky Strikes for 40 years. He could only get cancer of the lungs from smoking. There was no other way he could have gotten it. And he died of the smoking, and I think he had a pretty good earning record and so forth. He died fairly young, so that he had the damages were going to be really good. But Mr. Sisser did all the research, and it turned out that the woman claimed she was married to the man who was bringing the suit, had a common law marriage. And she could not prove that she had a common law marriage. And that's the way he won the case. So it was one of the first cigarette cases the cigarette company won. So, but
Where was the lawsuit?
it was in Connecticut. And I don't know what he was doing in it, but anyway.
So the reason they lost simply was she didn't have standing.
She didn't have standing as a plaintiff.
Wow. Again,
Oh, it was a
another thing I
perfect
did not
case.
know.
I was fascinated by that he would have the interest and the understanding to go beyond just the legal case and see whether or not the woman had standing, and then go further and proving. You remember common law marriage was,
Oh, yes, I deal with that in the courtroom,
yeah, well, they finally got rid of it.
for the most part.
Yeah.
Well, what is another interesting case that the law firm was involved in that you would like to tell, or an interesting story about one of the lawyers that worked here that was one of your partners?
Well,
Just share some more history for the Dauphin County Bar Association's Oral History Project.
no, Spencer Gilbert, or Lyman Gilbert, and my grandfather, who was in another law firm, Marlin Opstead, they were one of some of the people who put together the Pennsylvania Bar in 1900.
Really?
Yeah, they were part of the Harrisburg contingent that does it.
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah. But that kind of history is there. And well, we've done Ralph, and W.S.T. Herlock was always a very colorful man. He thought he would look like the Duke of Windsor. And he parted his hair down the middle, and he drove one of the first Lincoln Continental cars.
In Harrisburg?
In Harrisburg. And I think he was a very good public utilities lawyer. Well, I didn't know him very well. But
Was it before you came with the firm?
yeah, he died in 1946. I didn't come till 1961. Yeah. So, but he was a friend of my father's. The two of them, my father and he, used to run St. Stephen's Church Cathedral.
And the school, but then
The school
Pat
wasn't.
Cameron ran
The
it.
school wasn't there yet. The bishop still lived where the school is.
Is that right?
I mean, he wasn't the bishop, but he was the dean. Dean Houston was.
Do you remember, I know you were not in court a lot, but a lot of the lawyers were. You traditionally had lunch together, all the partners would have lunch together on Fridays and
We
talk
still
about
do
cases.
that. We still do that.
At the Tuesday Club, I remember.
And we did it at the Tuesday Club. Then I got tired of the Tuesday Club, and then the Tuesday Club left us or whatever,
Closed.
closed. And so, but we still have lunch every Friday.
Which is a lovely tradition, I think.
It is. We still have. If we ever got to 15 or 20, it would be a little more difficult, but maybe not everybody would come. They used to have, when we were, before you came, we got to about 14.
Well, I think I was the first woman the law firm hired,
Yeah.
which
You
was
were.
sort of a shake-up.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have,
That was
since
in
you've been here,
1979.
since you were here, we've had Renee Lear and Jody Beyerschmidt and
Lucinda.
and Suzanne Friday, and now we've got Taya Polino. We have.
So I didn't ruin it for the other women.
No, I would say, and we were hiring an associate in August who's a woman, so we'll have 2 women, and they like this clerk who drives down from Penn State every day. I guess she's going to be with us in the fall, driving down from Penn State, but she's staying for the summer in Lewistown. So by the end of the summer, we're going to have 3 women, or probably by next year, we're going to have 3 women lawyers.
Well,
in the
that's
office.
great. That's very
Well, I would
good
think we're going to go more, because after you left, I was doing the hiring. It was very hard to hire either black people or women in this firm, because they were all the good ones were being caught up. So we were really lucky, we thought, change of attitude perhaps, when we got Jody and Renee. But they had various connections with the firm and stayed on, and then Jody went to the Department of Insurance, and Renee went over to buy I can't remember what the firm is. She's now up at McNeese,
Yeah.
doing personnel work. So I would say the firm's going to turn heavily to women.
Well, I think that you should be happy for that, because I think.
Well, we are, but they're also the best qualified that we can see to hire.
Well, that's good.
So it's nice that the two things have come together.
It sure is. Well, I want to thank you very much for
Okay.
your time, and I'm sure there's 100 more things I would love to ask you, but the time is running short. We've been here.
That's good.
Is there anything else you think you would like to share with us?
Well, I was given yesterday a book like this with these things from a friend of mine who's a lawyer in Bucks County named Larry Grimm,
Yes.
Grimm and Grimm. I wouldn't write that kind of stuff that he has all of his life, and how he's got his divorce in there and his new life. So I'm glad we were able to do it this way.
Okay. And we won't put on film about the wallpaper.
We could do that if you wanted.
Well, tell me about that. Do you remember that?
Well, you were a new associate and I was the managing partner, and you asked me whether or not you could redecorate your office. That's the way I remember it.
True.
And I said I had to talk to the partners because I didn't know where my authority was, because I was a brand new managing partner. So I talked to the partners, and they said they wanted to know what you were going to do with the walls, which was probably insulting, but amused me. So I came and asked you verbatim what you were going to do.
Right.
And you said you were going to put up nude pictures of Ralph Boyles.
Oh. And you took that back to.
I took that right back to the partners.
And then what happened?
They decided they weren't going to get into that.
Well, I'm not sure why I would have had the audacity to say that, but I probably was just having fun with you.
I know you were. So I decided I was going to have fun with the partners.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your
Okay,
time.
it's a pleasure, always.
It's
Yes.
been an honor to know you.